one of the problems of Mannerism is that there was, like, when the art came out and it appeared in this way, not everyone liked it. People criticized it. And if you imagine Vasari, Giorgio Vasari is the person who we still get our idea of history. And I posted a image with the biblical time on it, like that people are in an ideal. There's like three conceptions of time. Above is the Greek conception of time, which is basically the Oedipal myth, and that is a person crawling on four legs in the morning, then they walk on two legs in the afternoon. That's like the peak, and then they fall and they're like in the decline into the sunset of their life. They're walking on three legs with a walking stick. So that is like how time appears in kind of human societies in one way. But in the second, there are two ways the Bible presents time, and these were very familiar to all the people. They would have listened to these stories week in, week out, day upon day. And that kind of the biblical, there's two. First of all, that the Bible surveys all of time from the past, from right from the beginning, the present, and the future, that a clear future that is to come. So you have this linear kind of time. And then you have, contrasted to the Greek time, you have the idea of people are in an ideal situation. They turn away from God. They have a fall and they're in a terrible situation. They then say, "Shit, what have we done?" Basically, usually a Messiah is sent, and that figure, like Moses or Jesus, restores the people to the pretty much the same position that they were before the fall. So it presents a reversal of time in that sense. Now, Vasari, when he writes history, and this is the interesting thing, he uses the term Gothic to describe what we call today Gothic architecture. However, when Gothic architecture was originally made, when it was being built, it was called Opus Francorum, which literally means the work of the Franks. And he is quite derogatory towards the people he sees as barbarians. This is, yeah, there's a bit of a rabbit hole to go into, but basically he presents time as the glories of the Roman Empire, then a fall into barbarianism, and then finally the Italian Renaissance arrives. We're restored to the glories of Rome, the place that we were before. Look at how clever we are. And that is the way that people kind of write history. They use those two modes of thought, which both come to us from the Bible. Now, the really interesting thing about this whole book is that Sjoerd van Taunen is using the term Mannerism. Like, Vasari takes the term Gothic and uses it like splat to categorize all the Gothic architecture, which was like quite a long period of nearly 400 years, pretty much 300, yeah, maybe even closer to 500, 400 years of architecture. He just splat labels it as Gothic. And Van Taunen is like, and art historians are both taking the term Mannerism and slapping it on as a label, categorizing all of this period of art, which may or may not be quite correct. As you were just talking about before, the way people and things are categorized. So
Something
with
I
that
find.
thought in our heads, we should start with this little first section. And what I want to do is just read the it's like about, it's 3.5 or 4.5 pages, down to that concept of mannerism, and then we can critique any of it. But I have a lot of images that I can also post, and I've just posted the Michelangelo ones to start with.
Just before we start the first chapter, I'd like a little thought about the mode of time. I find it interesting that they follow a sort of beat of three, no matter which. I mean, first of all, you've listed 3 modes of time, but also each mode has like 3 different sections to it. It made me think about triangulation, which is more of a literary concept, but also has been applied psychoanalytically as well to describe social situations we find ourselves in, usually when there is an object of desire and 2 participants looking at that object. And then through pure circumstance, no matter who we are or our individual feelings, there is like an element of soft competition for that thing. But this is mostly a literary concept. However, I thought, interesting, there's no triangle because shapes must not exist on the 4th dimension as we know them, right? As in, the reason I talk about the 4th dimension is because that's one way of conceptualizing process, right? Time, event space. And I was thinking that a rise and fall, or a fall and rise, must be represented the same way through time. At least if you think about a triangle unfurled out in time, it just looks like a straight line, right? And so I find, I don't know if this is too apopheniac as well, but I was also thinking about the nature towards music, triplets in music, or how on a piano or on a guitar, usually it's 3 fingers you hold down to play a chord. Pleasing symphonies are ones that start on major, go anywhere else, and end on major. It's just a consistency that has, been found throughout music. Or if you end on minor, it sounds discordant. But if you start with minor, go anywhere, end minor, it feels pleasing. So it doesn't matter what the affect is, because minor is melancholic and sad. Major is bright and beautiful. Doesn't matter what the affect is. There's always a comforting familiarity about the cyclical nature of returning to where you started. Why, the Jews circling Sinai for 40 years, it must have both felt like forever and, an imminent moment at each point. I just think that I'll stop waffling, but I do think that the idea of 3 seems somewhat powerful here.
Did you say that?
And I would say to you, when I think of architecture, I actually think about it as circle thinking versus triangle thinking. And I see the Italian rational as being the triangle thinking. It's a ratio. It must be to the set of specific rules, while the circle thinking is like a different thing, something from which there's a breaking down and a re-emergence of something new. And I mean, if you're someone into Deleuze and Guattari, I'm not really into their work, but I guess you could think of it as perhaps being more rhizomatic than the irrational triangle thought. So circle versus triangle is one of the ways I think about it.
I think I know Brett wanted to say something really quickly, but I'll just respond to
go on.
that. Something I find interesting about the circle thinking is that I know you yourself, in a previous reading as well, about this idea of starting in the middle or suddenly emerging from obviously a huge continuation of things, but not necessarily being the effect of a cause. This is kind of where in the book the concept of secondness comes up, right? You have emerged from nowhere, but your relation is that you were preceded. That's all you know. But it's not as if you are the, only possible continuation of the line. That's why a lot of movements, even within the same field, like within architecture, you see adjacent movements everywhere. It is not as if there is one linearity to historical thinking.
And I'll just add one very last brief thing. I don't see circle thinking as being cyclical. That's absolutely not what I think of at all.
Important distinction, yeah.
Hmm.
So
Was there something? Yeah.
yeah, so Mannerist art sort of broke away from that sort of emphasis on maybe simple geometric um, clarity, I guess. Is that what was sort of being said a little bit ago?
Well, not quite this. There is a certain clarity in the earlier work. Like it's when you look at the religious art, it has a clear meaning, and it would have had a clear meaning to the viewer. But when people before Michelangelo in the Renaissance creating art, the person's head must be 1/7 of the body. And it doesn't matter how big the person's head really is, but for it to be proportionally beautiful, it must be within this particular ratio. It must be 1/7. And so there are this set of rules, and the Mannerists break all those rules. But then in the medieval times, the and this is not to say, in my view, the Gothic architecture is also a rational architecture, but it's trying to do something else. But it isn't beholden to these ratios or sets of rules in the art that the Italians are rather beholden to.
Yeah, so that movement from
Exactly.
triangular thinking to circular thinking sort of emphasizes some stuff that we've mentioned before regarding the movement away from stability and harmony, the movement away from balance and order, and more towards elongated, distorted figures that convey emotion and drama. But some I've thought before about not really about the triangle per se, but now I'm thinking about it in this way. But I've thought before about the Trinity in like typical Christian thought as maybe representing like a primitive form of the real, or a primitive form of that like underlying, unchanging, eternal thing that's responsible for everything. Um,
Mm.
and I've always sort of wondered what uh, the Trinity means. There is some a while back I did actually find some really interesting information on um, why it was a Trinity that was used, but I'll have to look why it came in threes. But I'd have to
Mm.
try find that again.
There's an interesting aspect, actually. Very sorry, I disconnected.
No.
Interesting aspect to the Trinity in that sometimes when we think of hylomorphism, that would be the transmutation of one thing into another. It doesn't require there to be two. Well, it would be wrong to say two entities if you're a Spinozist. I'm just going to say two entities. Just to think about one thing transforming into another is not enough. There always has to be a third thing. That's why the amalgam of, God, golem, man works. It's an amalgam because they all represent the same thing, and yet they are three very distinct ways of like viewing it from a purely perspectival stance, right? Um, and so yeah, I think the idea of phylomorphism actually requiring almost some referent that exists outside of both entities. Um, I find that somewhat fascinating. And this is purely a schizophrenic thought at this point, but like one more thing and then I'll shut up. Or maybe I'll talk about the blueprint, but we can continue. I find it interesting how uh, psychoanalytically speaking, introversion is not only a thing you experience alone, but then everything with another person is extroversion. You actually require three people for a exchange to become extroverted. If it's a one-on-one conversation with somebody, to Jung, that would be an introverted exchange. And I find it interesting that from that perspective, the idea of two mediators is almost like a communion, whereas two more than two communicators, suddenly it's a social setting or a gathering, right?
And I
But yeah,
think
the three comes from largely from Pythagoras. It was like the most basic pattern that could exist. So like three, it was like the smallest, simplest way the pattern, like a pattern, like emerged. And so it was like in his whole cult thing, it had a huge following. That's one of the reasons it ended up like filtering into like the notions of the Trinity later on, because the Greeks and the Romans had a lot of influence on the path of Christianity.
Mm.
Anyway, but it also three is a pretty common thing in most cultures around the world too, and like there's not a very clear reason why. Like sometimes it's like a close, like it sounds like other things. Like I think it's Chinese. Like the word for three is close to the word for like being alive or something like that. I remember. This is I'm pulling this from like the depths of my like first undergrad myth class like forever ago, but
That's
like
okay.
some of it's more prominent because it is a pattern. It's like very simple geometry. You know, most of the pyramids, like in the southern parts of America, like in the U.S., like the mound builders, they used like a base three system, and they used like things based on triangular geometry because it's like the strongest and simplest sort of recreatable structure you can
Mm.
make with Earth, like off like right off the bat, things like that. And yeah, so like three, it's there is stuff to it, but yeah. Anyway, sorry, getting out
That's
off
okay.
track here. But
Would you like to know one more
the
interesting
notion,
thing?
yeah, the notion of the Trinity though comes from the Pythagorean sort of cult.
That's interesting. Thank you for the because well, I mean, I guess that proves the triangle came first, right? But
Yeah,
um, one like tiny interesting tidbit as well about the Chinese and Japanese scripts is that I was vaguely aware that three meant life, but also I find it extremely interesting that four in both languages means death. Um, at least in Japanese, I know it's shi, which is the root for shine, which is die. That's why some particularly auspicious places in both countries, at their discretion, they will remove a fourth floor. They will list it as the fifth floor, even though in reality it's the fourth one, right?
yeah, we do that in the U.S. with 13. There's not a lot of 13th floors.
Interesting.
so on this. There was another thing I forgot to mention. If we're moving from this notion of triangular thinking to circular thinking, and we're thinking about it in terms of the triangle being like a primitive idea of the real, um, then there would have to be a different conception of time too that would come about from transferring from a triangular form of thought to a more circular form of thought. Um, and some things about this is that it's not it also sort of touches on how mannerism doesn't entirely like outright reject what came before,
Mm.
but
But it's not referencing it
yeah, it doesn't reference it.
as such. Yeah.
It it embeds like its work in this religious art, but it still pushes those boundaries, and breaks those laws of what came before.
Mm.
Um, and
I,
if if
oh,
we
sorry,
think
go
about
ahead.
it that way, triangular thinking and circular thinking, they do have some sort of similarities that you could think of, but very crucial differences. Because we have the Trinity, which um, sort of exemplifies these three distinct entities: God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost, and how they all exist in a perfect unity and harmony. Um, and in this sort of relationship that maybe ties back to what Joby was saying about how you need to have a couple people to make the triangle work, or you need to have a couple people talking to each other. Whereas um, the the circle, um, how would I say this exactly? The circle emphasizes um, Mannerist thought by being a more complex and ambiguous symbol, one with more emotional intensity, one that invites multiple, multifaceted interpretations, and really resists any sort of straightforward analysis and nice balanced geometric analysis. Um, and
That's interesting.
yeah, it
The
combines
way
all of these conflicting elements within a singular composition. So instead of needing three people, a mannerist thing can be this. Instead of it being external, it could be this very internal and personal tension and fluidity.
And it's not necessary to say one mode of thought came before the other.
Yes.
They're like two prevailing counter modes of thought.
Yeah, there's a like a depth and multiplicity in circular thinking
Hmm.
that triangular thinking doesn't get at. And it's
I
also not immediately apparent in the circular thinking.
Yeah, I think that one aspect in which you pointed out a bifurcation earlier was the fact that the triangle is a representation in space within space, if that makes sense. As in, I'm pretty sure, when I think of Pythagoras being like, stroking his beard quizzically, I think he's got a big old walking stick and he's like scrawling in the sands, right? And he's like, by Jove, I've got it, right? Um, but that's an aspect of two dimensionality, which is possible within three dimensionality, but at the same time, it introduces a very unique notion to 2D space in that this is a realm of representation now. This is what um, would make a kind of I don't want to call it a dual thinking. I don't want to call it split thinking. I don't want to introduce it as a binary, but this would introduce like the idea of abstract notion being able to be represented by what Descartes might argue would be a priori knowledge, right? Yeah, the sorry, I jump scared myself leaving the call. Um, the a priori knowledge in this case being a um, idea or a concept of a triangle before you're even exposed to one, which is eventually contestable statement. But I think I know Chomsky as a linguist is like purported similar ideas as well about this kind of like a priori knowledge, but whether it is the case or not. I don't know, it's contestable. I digress a little bit though. I think that the important point I wanted to make was just the representation of the triangle to Pythagoras must have meant something wholly different to the experience of time as circular. Or at the very least, what I mean by that is more no matter how you represent the world, there is also a world, and the very imminent nature of the changing of the seasons, the cyclical nature of life, would have been a very much apparent and not irreconcilable fact with the triangle, but taking on a completely different meaning, I think. Um, I just think it's interesting that, I suppose the final point being, as soon as the triangle is represented, all of a sudden we see how powerful the idea of triplets is, and the idea of representation itself kind of becomes of representation not trying to cover up the world, but in Pythagoras' sense, um, trying to trying to represent something imminent about the world itself. If that's a case to be believed, right? You could argue Pythagoras was trying to represent something maybe numerical about the world,
Well, yeah,
or at least something that doesn't emerge from phenomena.
with like triangular thought going back to conceptions of time for the Greeks, and I this makes rational sense to me if I were to be religious in some way, but they saw God as existing outside of time, time space, so uh, that God could see everything and could manipulate everything. And it isn't really until you get to Christianity where they put God inside of a human body and made him killable that you fuck up everything, all that thinking. But there's something with circular thinking where instead of emphasizing a disconnect with triangular thinking, you are emphasizing an interconnection or interconnectedness. And you emphasize the relationality that we've talked about before with Mannerism, where each piece is interconnected, and if you take a piece of one, then it ruins the whole thing. And it also invites just constant exploration, because maybe cyclical thinking is not circular or cyclical thinking is not quite the right way to think of it, but maybe as a continuation with no definite end point in sight, that constantly invites ongoing engagement and reconsideration and perpetual exploration. And yeah, that's my last thought on it.
No worries. Let me just pull up the PDF again on my phone, and then I'm happy to continue reading.
Or start.
Awesome.
True.
How much can we pull out of triangles versus circles?
Everything.
Yes, it's very triangle Jack, but I've already painted myself as the circular chap. Okay, I'm good. I got the PDF up. Also, hello, Clay. If you want to follow along with us, buddy, we are just starting chapter 1 of the Mannerism book. I don't know if you're driving right now.
No.
Yeah. Hi. No worries, man.
Well, there is a plethora of art there
that you should not look at whilst driving.
Again, nearly at the end. Well, that's 10 items. I'm just going to post them the last 10. I tried to download them in order so I could smash them up and you could go through and see the work of each artist. It is a tiny bit jumbled and mannerist, but I mean, I guess that's just the way it is. But I guess you can, if you're curious about a particular work of art, you can search it with the Google lens to see which exact artist, because he references a plethora of artists in the in this little part. So here we go. Philosophy and art history. The problem of Mannerism. In art history, Mannerism generally refers to European art situated chronologically between the Italian High Renaissance and the early Baroque, with firm roots in the former and in part overlapping with the latter. Roman and Florentine practitioners of the fine arts, such as Michelangelo, Pantormo, Bronzino, Rosso, Parmigianino, Lomazzo, Beccafumi, Salviati, Cellini, Del Vaga, Macchietti, Cavallori, Bologna, and Buontalenti are widely regarded as Mannerists, as are the North Italians such as Dossi, Romano, Genga, Lotto, Tintoretto, and outside of Italy, El Greco, Arcimboldo, the school of Fontainebleau, and the schools of Antwerp and Haarlem. whereas Renaissance artists seek a harmonious relation, however fragile, between genius and rule, creation and imitation, beauty and reality. According to received wisdom, Mannerists defend artistic freedom, resist authorities, break the rules, not out of ignorance, but in the name of rivalry and virtuosity. Even when they set out from the imitation of natural models and earlier masters, they subordinate this imitation to a quest for amplification and renewal. The doctrine of disegno interno, that is literally internal design, Federico Zuccaro, the drawing after an inner vision guiding the hand, replaces the disegno esterno of external models that dominated the Renaissance formalism. Unlike 15th century classicism, where the prevailing image of art prescribed that art's task lies in the reproduction of beauty found in nature as a divine product, in the 16th century, the principle of fantastica idea leads to a confrontation between nature and artistic creativity. Formal traits include an abstract and derealized treatment of content, elegant and witty figures, a skewed perspective, or an extremely crowded composition. The organization of the pictorial surface, for example, often deliberately contradicts the illusion of depth, flattening and obscuring the deep linear perspectival space of high Renaissance painting, such that Mannerist figures appear as forms absorbed in a background of indeterminate dimensions, with their contours bent and extended into those of other objects whose spatial orientation is different or even opposite or lost. Typical characteristics are small but graceful heads, queerly elongated limbs or slender physiques, hyper-refined gestures that nonetheless lack subjective control, contrived and constricting spatial relationships emphasized by juxtapositions of harsh colors and or grotesque scala and thematic imbalances. Deeply rooted in rhetoric, the single most important aesthetic premise of Mannerism is the cultivation of style. The term Mannerism derives from the Italian maniera, which has its origins in the older literature of aristocratic etiquette. In the 16th century, the age of refinement, Henry Faucillon, it becomes used by artists for justifying themselves in public controversy. In aesthetic theory, the notion appears with Giorgio Vasari, in whose work the idea of manner is used in at least 3 different ways: for affirming a positive judgment of artistic quality, for describing the stylistic freedom and method specific to an individual artist, and for defining a general style, such as the maniera greca, the Byzantine style, or the maniera moderna, to which Vasari also counted himself, and to which we now generally refer as Mannerism. In Vasari, manner marks a loss of artistic innocence, since the modern artist is now explicitly expected to go beyond the general taste. For the first time, the infamous figure of the artist as born under Saturn makes his appearance, with eccentric behavior rooted in Platonic mania, the sacred madness of enthusiasm and inspiration, without which there would be no fantasia or imagination, and thence no disegno or artistic design. As historic stylistic category, it is contrasted to the aesthetic judgment of mannered stylization, manierato or manieroso, that Vasari criticized, for example, in the self-generating abstraction of Perugino, in whose work artistic creation would be reduced to stereotype, witty affection, preciosity, artificiality, and technical facility. Reflecting its vulgar meaning until today, art historians have for a long time regarded Mannerism mainly in this second sense, as the uncomprehending and mannered imitation, or Entartung, and this literally means like a decomposition or the degeneration, literally a degeneration of some previous, more mature style. From the beginning, they have understood the history of art as something that is cyclical, passing through successive stages of blossoming, flowering, and decay. And it was classical proto-art historians such as Giovanni Pietro Bellori and Luigi Lanzi who gave the art of maniera its negative connotation as the outside against which the historical self-understanding of classical art has traditionally established itself. They saw art reduced to artifact, a form experiment that blocks the transparency and spontaneity of natural forms. Their rejection bears great similarity to the way postmodernism would later be regarded as a decadence of the modernist revolutions, with artists trying ever harder to be noticed, developing signature styles and personal quirks that make them instantaneously recognizable, but prohibit the growth of new schools. Perhaps the most exemplary of that judgment, is the judgment of Heinrich Wölfflin, the first art historical authority to undertake an anti-classical re-evaluation of the Baroque, who still ignored Mannerism as an independent movement and took the first stage of the Baroque merely for the style into which the Renaissance resolved itself, or as is more commonly expressed, into which the Renaissance degenerated. The 20th century has seen a great diversity of attempts in art history to reinterpret and revalue Mannerism in positive terms and for apparently non-classical purposes. The first was prepared by Alois Riegel's Studies of Late Roman Art, 1901, and of Baroque Art, 1908, and can be situated in the 1920s in Germany and Austria. While the founders of art history, besides Riegel Wölfflin, struggled to explain the phenomenon of the Baroque, their pupils, among them scholars such as Max Dvorak and Walter Friedlander, and Nicholas Pevsner, architectural historian, undertook a first canonization, since among the Gothic, the Renaissance, and the Baroque, Mannerism alone is an ism. Even allowing for esque variations, it solicited analogies with modernist movements such as Expressionism, which it provided with an alternative to the opposition between academic realism and impressionistic idealism. As Erwin Panofsky acknowledges in his classic Idea, 1924, Expressionism is related to Mannerism in more than one sense. It comes with the particular speculation that guides us back to the paths followed by the metaphysics of art from the 16th century theory, paths that seek to derive the phenomenon of artistic creativity from an extrasensory and absolute, or as we say today, cosmic principle. Moreover, the Expressionists recognized in Mannerism a spiritual crisis and a sense that history was coming to an end that prefigured the catastrophes of their own time without any compromise with Baroque kitsch. Thus, in the Almanac de Blaue Reiter, that's the Blue Rider, Robert Delaunay's Eiffel Tower featured directly next to a St. John by El Greco. They saw Mannerism as a time of intense disenchantment and contrition, in which the natural light of the Renaissance was replaced by a new opacity. Beauty and truth, form and significance were no longer theologically connected. One could speak of a spiritual catastrophe which preceded the political one, and which consisted of the collapse of the old, worldly, ecclesiastically, scientifically, and artistically dogmatic systems and categories of thought. What we observe with Michelangelo and Tintoretto on the limited field of artistic problems was the criterion of the whole age. The paths which until then had led to knowledge and to the construction of a spiritual culture were abandoned, with the result an apparent chaos, just like our own age appears to us as chaotic. The second attempt at a non-classical approach to Mannerism emerged in and around the 1960s, when more specialized works flourished by scholars such as Wiley Cypher, 1955, Eugenio Battisti, 1960, Francet Würtenberger, 1962, Jacques Busquet, 1964, Giuliano Briganti, 1965, André Malraux, 1974, and Roberto Longhi, 1976. As 40 years before, Ernst Curtius, 1957, and Gustav René Hotchker, 1957, discover in Mannerism a first modern avant-garde, a precursor to the work of Cézanne, Klee, Kolwitz, and Matisse. For them, Mannerism is not just the name for the style of the late Cinquecento. It is used for a surrealistic and structurally anti-classicist phenomenon that critics see recurring throughout European art, from François Denom, Monsu Desiderio, to De Chirico, and from Arcimboldo to Dali. Classicism is no longer identified only with the High Renaissance, but with any ordered or formed milieu whatsoever, and Mannerism with a proto-revolutionary tendency towards monstrosity and terribilitia. Others, such as Arnold Hauser, 1964, and Tibor Klenice, 1971, placed Mannerism in relation to ideological movements which, like Expressionism, are seen as stemming from the unrest of their age, whereas the decades around 1500 constituted a period of great hope for harmony and tolerance that was reflected in ideals of humanism and perfection. The 16th century brought to light the weaknesses of early capitalism, marked by diseases and famines caused by urban overpopulation, a crisis of faith and conscience that culminated with the closure of the Council of Trent in 1563, Ottoman and religious wars of unknown intensity and cruelty, the rise of absolutism, the Inquisition and the witch hunts, the sack of Rome, and political revolutions in Florence. For artists, the situation became even more precarious, with the attainment of equality between the mechanical arts and the liberal arts in defiance of the trade guilds, as it consigned them to fierce competition and the capricious patronage of princes and nobles. The Mannerist artists found themselves alienated in a situation of social uprooting, often resulting in an apocalyptic sense of time. There appears to have been a veritable suicide epidemic, noted by Michel de Montaigne, who observed that even the children are taking their lives. The Mannerist crisis of style would mirror these spiritual, material, and intellectual crises that brought about the decline of the Renaissance. But whereas Mannerists still represented the spiritual elite of their age, upholding the cosmopolitan point of departure of Renaissance humanism, this attitude was soon, with the anti-intellectual inclinations of Baroque sensualism, to become an anachronism. Many of the inspirations and references in the arguments that follow come from these major attempts in art history to provide both an anti-classical and modernist concept of Mannerism and differentiate it from the Baroque. It is the dissolution and not the appearance of the Renaissance that created the conditions for modern art: Expressionism, Surrealism, pop art, postmodernism. The counter-reformatory Baroque attempt to overcome this crisis in the name of a renewed cultural unity or harmony, by contrast, is too reactionary and historically bound to pass for a revolutionary breakthrough. Mannerism is, to borrow a term from Riegel, a battlefield, a struggle over a tradition of which the certainties begin to falter. It reveals the Renaissance itself to be less the splendid and mature equilibrium between matter and form perceived by Winckelmann than the impure and incomplete play of forms and forces described by Jacob Burckhardt. Only when style becomes problematic does it become programmatic. As Hauser argues, its critical condition is the normal state of creativity rather than its exception. During its longer periods of history, art seeks to retain as much as possible of the confusing, incomprehensible, and inexhaustible wealth that classicism seeks to hide behind its crystalline forms. Thus, instead of keeping us from using the term Mannerism, the often heard warning that art during the period following the deaths of Pope Leo and Raphael lacked the unity of the classic style, and that the artist's preference for experimentation has resulted in a variety of styles, it is precisely a reason to opt for it. If there was a triumph of Mannerism, as the title of the first comprehensive exhibition worldwide, the Rijksmuseum 1955, suggests, this is also a triumph for art, as it emancipates itself from the classical identity of art in a generalized will to style.
If anybody would like to say anything, I've got the notes, so I don't yap immediately.
Went so hard. Mannerism is not will to power, it is will to style.
Holy. Mannerism goes harder, better, faster, stronger. Yeah, the generalized line of going all out. Holy.
Well, so there was a word that was used, entartung, right?
Entartung, yeah.
Entartung.
And if you imagine, the Nazis used this in their description of Entarter Kunst, the degenerate art.
Yeah.
So you might have seen the term used there, but it's about a degeneration.
And it was used by the Nazis to denounce like modern art movements, right?
Yeah.
Like Mannerism.
Picasso, people like that. Well, more the moderns, like people like Beckman, people like Picasso, and after the impression, like the surrealists and the Dada people after World War One, the Nazis did not like them.
I find that through line very interesting in the elimination from the social field a particular style of culture that is antithetical to the kind of world that you want to bring about. In the sense that it is a very reactionary point of view to take in the view that you are reacting to the material phenomenon that emerges from cultural products and saying that the rot and disease exists within the representation of the thing. So as opposed to denying it ideologically, because your ideology is somewhat weak and esoteric and baffling, and there's no core. Instead, what you do is you attack the material, you remove the paintings, you burn the books, you try and remove, or like in the case of Nazi politics, especially because it's a purity politics, which is a very specific blend of like fascism that was experienced at that time. Because it's a politics of purity, a social quarantine is seen as like the ideal, like a culturally social quarantine, sorry, as in it's enough to burn the books and to erase the memory of people. This will be enough to get rid of the thought, right? But I find it interesting that the idea of a degeneration comes up quite a few times, especially there was one contrast between the postmodern degeneration of the modern, but that it reflected, I suppose, the not necessarily the Mannerist degeneration of Renaissance art, but the inability of the Renaissance artists to feel like they were living amongst a stable world. Um, the sort of degeneration of a traditional order which began to break up a long time ago. Um, the idea that there was a decline in the horizon of religiosity is always extremely interesting to me because we see in the like High Renaissance brand new conceptualizations of man cropping up everywhere, and it comes hand in hand with this decline in a maybe a faith in a higher power to uh, ascertain like a good life here. Um, and this is kind of, I think, where we see for the first time, the concept of an auteur emerging, or at least a modernist concept of the artist or the author, because the artist is like new again in Renaissance times, because they're emerging around about this idea of the auteur emerges around about the same time as well, but the idea of the great man principle emerges, right? Um, uh, as that is a precept to modernist belief in emancipation, in liberty, in freedom to choose, all this stuff, right? So it's interesting how the idea of an artist now as a much more important category, or at least a category with things added onto it, right? I think it was mentioned in the reading at some point that uh, artists were in a bit of a fucked position because they were seen to have to go now beyond what was considered the normal or general taste in order to make anything worth respecting. But at the same time, they had to be extremely knowledgeable people. They were in contention with the um, the mechanical arts, right? Whereas they had to be versed in both the mechanical
It's
arts
the
and the liberal
rise
arts.
of the printing press around that time,
Mm,
and that if you can imagine, the painters would hire a person who was an engraver. I think
yeah.
I've posted some pictures on here to give people an idea of what the engravings were, but the engravings could be mass produced on a printing press
Yeah.
versus
The
a painting still takes the same time to paint a painting. So this
it's
was, you have this
extremely
technological rise in the background, and like we could also compare that today where technology is like mass production. So they were
mm,
one of the first groups in history to face that like competition from mechanical
I see what you mean.
yeah, artificial
The
intelligence. I mean, you could compare it to so many things and contemporary
of
things,
course.
but
I
that's
think
what they were facing. Yeah.
yeah, I've only partly read it, not cover to cover, so my knowledge might be pretty bad. But I did quite enjoy Walter Benjamin's I think The Age of Art in a time of mechanical reproduction or mass production, something along those lines.
Mm.
Um, and it is interesting to see the both like the excitement and revulsion at technologies that, in some ways, democratize, if you want to use that word, a form of art that is previously a privileged right. At the same time, I think people are well aware of like the upheavals socially, but also the reach with now people had to compete. What struck me actually about the particular reading we just went through and it's a representation of the world in which the Renaissance must have been appearing as. Sorry, let me rephrase that. The world of like disappearing ground in which certain positions were more precarious than others, the artist especially here. It reminds me of what we typically blame neoliberalism for today, which is the actual upheaval of traditional orders. It's the dissolution of stability. It is the ever more precarious and atomizing nature that we sort of have found has crept into every sort of facet of the way that we live today. Um, it's similarly rivaled here in the ways of considering the social upheaval that must have been happening, as you said, with the introduction of new technologies like the printing press, the changing moral and ethical landscape of this decline in this religious worldview, and the creation of like new identities, new ways of being, ways of life, ways of structuring society. Um, it strikes me as being a very dog eat dog world, to be honest. And the idea of I hadn't considered it before you brought it up, the printing press, but this idea of an attention economy almost creeping into life, perhaps like ontologically speaking, right? They wouldn't have thought of it that way, but the idea of like there are only so many eyes in the world and needing to be unique, needing to be distinct, needing to go beyond the general taste just to leave a mark. I find that uh, just very interesting. I did have another point, but it's separate. But if anybody else would like to talk,
Well, something that was kind of interesting was that other word a little bit back, um, and Mannerism with a proto-revolutionary tendency toward monstrosity and terribilita. Um,
Mm.
and terribilita meaning terrifying majesty, or that intense, um, and it sort of is used to refer to the proto Mannerist work of Michelangelo and the powerful emotional impact that it can bring about. Um, so maybe we could look at, I'm not too certain about this one, but maybe we can look at terribilita as like the opposite of the German word for degeneration, where it's like, no, Mannerism is not a degeneration. It is a awe-inspiring and sublime monstrosity and terror that inspires through grandeur and emotional intensity.
I like how you make the contrast because I would not have thought of them as contrasting terms. Because to me, I think degeneration inspires particular feelings of awe, in the same way that uh, a the way in which uh, this kind of terribilita refers to like an oppressive but elegiac force, something that is like uh, it just seems that there's such a particular blend of it's you know what's super similar actually. If we're comparing, sorry, I don't want to go too off my rocker here, but if we're comparing it to postmodernism, if we look at what people called, I think it was Jameson calls the postmodern sublime, you find an absolutely similar idea of a free floating impersonal ecstasy, which is above and beyond any subjective feeling. And yet, this same ecstasy spills over into dread. It would be like a jouissance in negative, right? I'm pretty sure it would be Baudrillard that would then go on to denigrate this dread or this fear and talk about how it is the turning of eyes inwards or more closely the schizophrenic no longer being able to retreat into a private inland empire because there is no private halo of protection to protect them anymore. The idea of like the penetration of mass media and larger forces from the outside in and always. Baudrillard obviously paid extensive attention to mass communication, right, as that emerges. But we can also consider, what was I going to say? We can also consider, if you want to bring the postmodern sublime back to a time where there is less maybe surveillance technologies or less penetrating forms of mass communication, despite the printing press obviously being formed as like the first wing of this extension technology to make anything, be anything, send it anywhere. Um, the It must have felt like an intensely humilifying thing to be an artist who is constantly having to like plug the Patreon to his patrons, right? Who's constantly having to produce, who is so unstable, essentially working like a 0 hour contract, right? If you think about it. This is not an enviable position to take. And yet the great man element of the author comes in where it's like, wow, you see all the sacrifices they make just to make their stickman figures when they were 5 real or something. Like, you know what I mean? There's a intense like passion also ascribed to these artists. They are seen as like the most intelligent people of the time. It's There's a small fact, if I'm not being too indulgent, that occurred to me, which was about the blueprint. I think I brought this up earlier before I rudely disconnected. And it is always very interesting to me that the blueprint is a Renaissance product. It's a Renaissance view of looking at the world. This came up when you were formulating about triangle thinking, I guess, in terms of like the golden ratio and pi and this aesthetic sensibility to marry what seemed to be the rules or underlying nature of nature into art. And the blueprint is like really fascinating to think about it, but I won't dwell on it too long. Where it's this marriage of representation and of art and of an aesthetic morality and also a way of thinking about the world. It's a diagram essentially, right? Equations are all around it. There's scales, there's distances, there's meters, but also there's a very beautiful element to the blueprint. It's not meant to just be a battle plan. It's also a piece of art in and of itself. People still love the Vitruvian Man. If anything, the Vitruvian Man is an extremely cogent representation of early humanist thinking and idealism, right? Um, the the Vitruvian Man is a blueprint. It's a blueprint for the perfect human agent, right? In a sense, or at least an aesthetically beautiful one. And this is to who we ascribe, to be the real representation of the face of man. And I think that what uh, what was I going to say? Sorry, I had a point on the Baroque Reformation, but I don't want to go on for too long.
No, no worries. Do you think the dialectical synthesis from the triangle to the circle? God, I'm forgetting what it is. Is the like that shell spiral that people are like, oh my God, the shell
Oh,
spiral.
fractals.
No, not fractals. It's the one that's like the shell spiral is in everything. The
Oh, the golden ratio.
yeah, the golden. It is called the golden ratio. Okay, is that the synthesis
It is, yeah.
of the triangle and the circle is the golden ratio?
That's something I find actually fascinating about the golden ratio is that, from a certain perspective, it almost is a 2D representation of 4D space. If you really want to get into the weeds of it, it's not a very defined one, but it's one nonetheless. If you want to read the spiral and the absolutely disappearing horizon, or at least it's so small that the human eye cannot perceive it, and yet it must exist on the fractal, like atomic, you know, beyond. It must exist beyond perception, right, for this spiral to uh, exist. I find it a very interesting mechanistic reproduction, perhaps, of the fourth dimension in 2D space, which is such a difficult thing to do. But I don't know, maybe that's a bit too, I don't know if it's too apathetic.
No, that connects. I mean, when we're talking about different conceptions of time and space, when you're moving to these different conceptions of thought, And also there is in one of the photos that Jay posted, there is a golden ratio. I don't I don't know what you call it, like a little structural building thing that is literally like a golden ratio spiral.
Really?
Yeah, it's under Buontalenti, like the second to last one.
Okay.
His name literally means good talent.
Good talent.
Holy, naming my child fucking six
Buon
so that they can get an
talenti.
art job. Yeah.
Let me see, where is the buon talenti? Beccafumi de Rossi. Salviati. Oh yeah, the little staircase, and it's got the spiral.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of how people are perceiving time now, kind of as a spiral going upwards.
Oh,
Like the dimensionality of it.
or is it the golden ratio, or is it called like what's the Fibonacci sequence? Is it?
The Fibonacci sequence is a sequence that gives digits of pi, I believe. Or I could be very wrong about that though.
Yeah, never mind. I don't. Yeah, the Fibonacci spirals. That's what it's reminding. Is that the synthesis of the triangular and circular thought? Because in order to do the Fibonacci sequence, you do have like a fourth of a circle, which is I don't know.
And if you want to talk about synthesis, go and find an MLL reading group. You got all the Maoists to that.
Yeah, what's the golden ratio then? That's because I was thinking of the Fibonacci.
Maybe
It's
the golden.
the same
Maybe the
thing.
golden. Oh, the golden ratio is pi. Actually, it just occurred to me.
Golden
Usually
ratio.
they draw it on a nautilus shell.
Yeah.
Mm.
I should probably post one.
They're the same thing. Fibonacci sequence and golden ratio are the same thing. Maybe. I mean.
Oh, so pi is the same thing as well. Holy, it's all. Wait, there's three things. You're saying?
Oh shit! There's three things. It all goes back to the triangle.
Damn. But the triangle again. The triangle did come first. Pythagoras kind of hit it at the park.
God, if I ever
Classic
go,
shape.
if I ever go insane, it's gonna be because of the number 3 and triangles.
Yeah, but number three is life affirming, actually, where you live right now. So you should be joyous.
True. I'm gonna look like Charlie
I
from
didn't
It's
know.
Always Sunny, but there's gonna be 3s drawn all over the wall.
I had a brief point actually to make about the Baroque Reformation whilst it's sort of in my head. Oddly enough, this is Hegelian, so sorry for chatting shit about you earlier. There were two historians, Giovanni Pietro Bellori and Luigi Lanzi. And they were the ones who attached a negative connotation to like Mannerist art. Because they saw it as an invasive force, or at the very least a corruptive force, or a corrosive force, right, against the reasonable, common sense thinking that art had like established itself upon. And obviously the arguments they gave were like, oh, it's reductionist, or you're not paying homage to the real beauties, Mother Nature. You're perverting natural form. However, the book goes on to then talk about the way in which postmodernity is then slandered. But I was thinking of it more in like a Hegelian sense, where I was like, oh yeah, I'm pretty sure there's a reason the Baroque Reformation never happened. I mean, there's one way of reading it in terms of the dialectic, which is that there is no anti movement. It just the negation of the negation does not exist. I think one of the reasons why the Baroque Reformation failed is quite. I mean, I'm going to sound a little bit It's because there is no return, right? The new is always found outside of itself. The real always threatens to break through. If you want to think about it in terms of process philosophy, there's an idea that rupture is ever permanent in a way of considering the world that does not rely on pre-Platonic forms. That there are no close-ended objects that were like existing throughout all the space and all the time, waiting to fall into our lap, but more so a series of relations, and the relations are the only things that can be understood. And when a rupture happens in a previous, between previous like open-ended objects, if you want to put it that way, it's not as if there's a rupture that remains open and all meaning is lost. It is that new sort of meanings and connections are like clawing at the surface. They're the things that rupture, right? And they're the things that like now attach to new things. There are new arms, there are new expansions, new folds. And so I feel like the fact it's very interesting that the Baroque Reformation fails. Despite that, Mannerism doesn't emerge as a champion. It simply is done away with in other ways. And to that I can't speak. I'd like to learn more.
One of the things in another paper was, I think it's Bellori, but Bellori was like a kind of hack writer who was paid by other members of the upper class to write scathing reviews on the new Mannerist art that was coming out because they didn't like it.
I see.
So it wasn't his own views that he was espousing. He was just paid to write like a hit piece.
Oh, he's a talking head.
Well, or like a newspaper editor, really.
Yeah, in a way.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I think it's Bellori. I'm not so sure about Salviati. I'd have to look at that paper again that I've read, but I think it's Bellori was the one who was paid by others to write critically on Mannerism. And again, Vasari does that. Vasari does that on Gothic. However, the Italians did pay and they looked after and restored Gothic buildings, and they saw them as like good but flawed, or in his writing, that's how they're viewing it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in a sense of Michelangelo's Terribilita. And yeah, so there's always that saying, oh, maybe this building was built on the backs of the poor or oppression or something, but it's a beautiful building. Like, but it's, you can have that critique. You can have that critique today. It doesn't change the aesthetic of the building. It's just like the history behind it is a horrible history. But yeah, I've kind of digressed. But the point was that he wasn't really. It may not have been his own opinion that he was really writing Bellori.
I get that feeling every time I walk in Down Square. I'm like, yeah, this palace. In an interesting way, whenever I think about the potentially oppressive history of a building's construction, to me it's funny because I'm looking at it from the outside in, and all I can see are walls. And when you think about the history of the building, you almost think of it like like a spirit roaming down the corridors, right, and like opening the doors. So I find it interesting. It's hidden behind closed doors, right? That's the term. The second point.
I have to correct myself here as well. It's not Bellori. It's Ludovico Dolce in 1557. He's the first author to point out the shortcomings of the art of his day, which he says were the fault of what was then called maniera in malaparte, which means in part bad. And then Bellori is writing over 100 years later in 1672, and he criticizes slightly Raphael and up to Carracci, and he describes them as corrupted with la maniera, So, yeah, but the one who's the hack writer who I was talking about, that was Ludovico Dolce, not Bellori. But
I
then
love the idea that,
Salviati,
yeah. Sorry, you go
I'll
ahead.
just check and see if he's mentioned it all.
Whilst you're checking, I love the idea that Dolce was writing this fucking hit piece, and then like, but Luigi Lanzi, it's all from the fucking heart. He hates change.
And yet, works by Vasari, Salviati, and by colleagues of theirs whom they held in high regard, are the very subject of the stylistic analysis advanced by these two art historians. And if Vasari cannot be called a Mannerist, who can? It is time, therefore, that we compared his remarks with the stylistic features which modern writers associate with Maniera and Mannerism. And this is from another paper, basically, as I was saying at the start. There are still, in the art world, I mean, I guess in caves or basements somewhere, still arguments about what really is mannerism. And there isn't really an agreement. There isn't really an agreement on it.
Do you guys still want to continue reading?
Yeah.
When,
We're at the
oh, go ahead.
concept of mannerism, page
That's
27.
right.
You want me to read till 29?
Yeah, I mean,
Just
actually,
one section, yeah, because I think it's like roughly 2 pages, and then you can talk about that.
yeah.
I might have to change devices halfway through, but I will just jump back on.
Oh, sure.
No worries.
The concept of mannerism. Although the last decades have brought to light many important new findings on particular figures, currents, and controversies of the 16th century, no new sweeping attempts have been made to give an encompassing definition of mannerism. As a consequence, the problem of its diverging interpretations and evaluations has never really been solved. Instead, everything happens as if the ambition or nature of art history's relation to historical episodes itself has changed to the point that it has become both impossible to use and impossible to abandon the notion of mannerism. Just like transcendentalism, god damn it. Today it is acknowledged that mannerism is a 20th century construction, an inexhaustible mirror image capable of giving our own time its own historical validity and prestige. But is it not typical of stylistic epochs that they can be scientifically determined only retroactively, and that they possessed no actual reality in that moment when they are said to have been current? In fact, the rejection of mannerism as a retrospective construction can neither be seen apart from the rise of formalism, iconology, and semiotics in art history in the past 50 years, nor from the discipline's increasingly positivist approach to its objects and its historicism with respect to their contexts. These are developments in which no earlier position has been saved from critical re-examination, albeit at the cost of the loss of an idea of artistic and creative practice capable of guiding historical research. With respect to mannerism, this shift in method is exemplified by the work of Craig Hugh Smith, John Shearman, Antonio Pinelli, and Daniel Arras and Andreas Tonsman. In each case, the inverse correlation between the extension of the concept and its comprehension, the more particularities it covers, the less meaningful it is given as one of the main reasons for restricting the attempt to define Mannerism as a real movement in art. But perhaps philosophy offers a different way out. Here we will not attempt to answer art historical questions, important in themselves, of whether Mannerism should be considered a historical, geographical, cyclical, or structural phenomenon, whether it is typical of a specific art or whether it is common to all arts, whether it is bound to a certain ideology, which artists can be grouped together under its label, and so on. Instead of reproducing, historicizing, or even summarizing all the controversies that abound in the determination of its extension, we should take seriously Deleuze's claim that a concept, insofar as it is philosophical rather than scientific, in itself contains neither extension, in our case a judgment on what can be empirically and historically classified as Mannerist, nor comprehension, a judgment on the meaning or content of the concept of Mannerism. Rather, its power is measured exclusively by its intention, that is, the singular tendencies that it manages to bring together according to the logic of the and, rather than of the is. Variety and conflict are not shortcomings of thought, but the original primitive form of dramaturgy that belongs to philosophy and distinguishes it from science. Who, which one, how many, from what point of view, in which case, to what extent? Philosophical concepts have neither an eternal essence nor an actual history, but only the virtual becomings they construct and concretize. While straddling as many diverse fields as... Huh?
No, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, for sure, no worries. While straddling as many diverse fields as possible, they abandon all reference to the actual and instead involve only allusions to it. Philosophy is speculation or science fiction, and the concept as a cloud, a multifaceted pearl. Barocco. Concepts are not generalities, but universal singularities in continuous variations, such as the fold as pure operative trait or pliability of the Baroque. They always correspond to a multiplicity, a system of entangled, connected, bifurcating trajectories. It's not a matter of bringing all sorts of things under a single concept, but rather of relating each concept to the variables that explain its mutations. Given the pandemonium of mutually contradicting historical determinations of Mannerism, we should therefore resist the usual definition of Mannerism in the widest possible sense as based on ambiguity and or contradiction. Rather, if the historiography of Mannerism has been a kaleidoscope, so many theses, so many empirical mannerisms, then the challenge for philosophy is to produce a concept that both retains the wealth of historical occurrences and brings them together in a negentropic order of becoming, that is, an inessential coherence that exceeds, not transcends, a shared age of reference and the confused determination of its historical existence. Philosophy does not consist in knowing and is not inspired by truth, as Deleuze and Guattari repeat in the manner of the pragmatists. Rather, it is categories like interesting, remarkable, or important that determine success or failure. The criterion of failure or success for proposing a concept is thus not adequacy to the given, but the movement to which it subjects the given. How does it redistribute the problems and concepts we think we already have? Even if the art historian and the philosopher refer to the same empirical facts and sources, their focus is not the same. No matter how detailed, the former is inclined to speak of whatever exists through general categories, while the latter seeks out its singularization, or what comes down to the same, the potential for novelty within the given. The task is therefore to combine mannerism as historical conjuncture with mannerism as a torsion of historicity that takes the form of afterwardness. Oh my god, that's a crazy German word. Nachtraglichkeit. I don't know. A history deferred and redoubled in relation to itself. For the very emphasis on manner or style, a purely processual term that enables us to define art as practice and event rather than as historical object and lineage, reflects this plurality and enables us to distinguish mannerism from the stylistic unity of the Renaissance and the Baroque.
Banger, banger chapter.
Right? That was
I was like,
good.
good. I liked how I was thinking, like, whoa, it's so cool that there's like art history, but then philosophy, and then I checked the chapter title, and it is philosophy and art history. Whoa, environmental storytelling. Um, yeah, no, obviously it tickles me as a, you know, delusion. I quite like a lot of the, uh, there's a lot of like really nice uh, phrases as well. Well, when they said about combining mannerism as a historical conjuncture with mannerism as a torsion of historicity. That is not what I thought would be the next three words. That is a very nice way of embedding one within the other. And I think that is exactly why mannerism speaks to a kind of rupture, not between, um, not a rupture between Renaissance art and Baroque art, but a rupture, just a rupture that emerges at the time. And I think that uh, I think Van Tun is doing a very good job not to like give some kind of contrast, or at least is like absolutely willing to think of it aside from a contrast or an outside of or an opposite to. That is exactly what the Baroque um, thinkers. Sorry, let me grab my notes. It's exactly what the Baroque thinkers um, like levied against Mannerism. They failed to think of Mannerism through its own terms. They could only think of it through Baroque terms, which would be the sensibilities of high art. And like, of course, it doesn't make sense. Of course, it can't be consumed. Of course, it can't be retroactively like hidden under the fold or like behind the carpet, right? Because it is threatening you. Or at least it's mollifying some pure ideal you have with the style in which you're comfortable within working, right? That's like what a lot of the criticism by Valori and Lancy were discussing. It was a perversion of nature almost, right? Or at least it's like getting close to it, because what you're doing is you're corrupting the beautiful natural form. You're experimenting with, stylistic obscurity. You are not revealing the world to people. But what the Baroque artists fail to realize is that high art is also a fucking representation. It's just attempting to a moral like cadence because it says we are trying to faithfully represent the world. There is no representation, right? So they kind of fail to see it. The criticism they then levy against sort of Mannerist from this point then is like doomed to fail because it does not recognize the rupture that has emerged, has already emerged, the dissolution of the old ways of thinking, the dissolution of any kind of stable tradition anyone can place ground on or have faith in, is crumbled a long time ago. And this is the very ground in which Baroque fine art establishes itself, right? It's concrete, it's traditional, it's something that's above the clamor of these times. Because obviously the Baroque artists were operating in a time of fundamental uncertainty as well. They just yearn to return, and of course, in that sense, we're doomed to fail, right? Again, the negation of the negation is not possible. So it's like a thought terminating cliche. You can't be anti mannerist in this sense, not in any meaningful sense, at least, not in the sense that mannerism cares about.
Well, it's
I was going to say, really
sorry.
quick.
Yeah.
If you think about Vasari was a mannerist, but he uses the term mannerist in three different ways. And he doesn't, like in his time, he couldn't see the connotations or the concept, but only with critical distance can we now look back on it and say he's actually describing also the philosophical thought of the time in that sense.
I get you. There is a repudiation which goes beyond like because when anyone criticizes art, there's always everyone hates critics for the sense that everyone likes to refer to taste as being subjective. That's why oftentimes we find like critics to be somewhat obstinacious, right? How are you placing a field over people's like subjective taste? It's kind of like, is that not a little bit crude? But at the same time, uh, to be retroactively. Wait, no. I lost my thought. I'll pass the torch.
Joby, what you were saying about the Baroque people saw Mannerism as a contradiction. They saw Mannerism as going no, when really Mannerism was going yes and would continually
Deconstruction says yes.
and it would just piss them off because you're not disagreeing with them, but you're adding. I don't know. For some reason, it would piss them off. But that notion of yes and really gets at the. I like the word that they used here earlier. Extension. Um,
Oh God, yeah.
because it's not transcendent. It's not even. It doesn't care about transcendence. It's just extending what was already there. And it also ties in very nicely to this notion that mannerism has been a kaleidoscope. Um, because usually and I'm very happy with this because a lot of the art pieces that I've been uh, fucking up and reworking for the Mannerist Zine, I'll sometimes use kaleidoscope effects.
Very nice.
Right. So, but what you do with the kaleidoscope is you take a portion of something, of some kind of image, um, and then you sort of extend that specific portion of it with different mirrors that go in that sort of circular shape. There's just a lot of connections there with that use of the word kaleidoscope. The relationality, the interdependence, the relationality, the circular thinking, the extendedness.
I think something important you touched on as well is that the aspect of the kaleidoscopic interpretation of mannerism is read from an art historical perspective, as in, despite art historians trying to level a meaning that works within the purview of art history for mannerism as a period of time or a particular style, any singularized attempt that they try is not matching up with a different art historian at a different time with a different criticism or a different following of the same 100-year-old hit piece, right? Or a different formulation of actually no, mannerism sits here at this time period. Or other people argue no, mannerism never existed at all. Other people then arguing mannerism is just the degeneracy of Renaissance into Baroque. Like the reason why there is such a breadth, I think, of it's not that people are positive or negative about it. It's that people are trying to explain it away and nobody can touch it, if that makes sense. Everyone can say anything they'd like to, but obviously, as Van Tunen has like studied, I suppose, it seems to be that a lot of these art historical conceptualizations of mannerism, none of them are like, I guess, to be discarded as such, but more so, it seems as if art history struggles to conceptualize such a different process of movement because it cannot historicize it. It cannot since the uh, how do I put it?
Well,
Since there seems to be such since there seems to be such like a philosophical or moral nature to mannerism, as in it appears to be an imminent response to a event, by which I mean they are trying to channel the anxieties and nature of the time, but they are also trying to escape representation as such. They are not looking to be like not they tend not to use concepts people haven't experienced before, but it's the shape of the form that is novel, right? It is not so much a distortion of reality in that it rejects reality, but it's a distortion nonetheless. But what this says, nobody can agree upon. And I think that when the art historians, such as the Baroque critics, try to do is again conceptualize decay in a language that only understands time as immortal and structures as solid. I don't know if I'm reaching too far here, but that's how it appears to me at least. To take that sort of I want to say top-down thinking, but that historicizing lens, and to retroactively attribute. This is a failure not just of taxonomy in general, but of a any kind of meaningful, I guess, a word escapes me here, but basically, there is still something that mannerism tries to relate, despite trying to remain elusive at the same time, right? It is rather not a corruption, but a one could think of it as a corruption, just as they think of weeds in the garden as like threatening to overturn the concrete in their house eventually. But at the same time, weeds can be seen as an extremely vitalistic force, right? Like the undergrowth always threatening to emerge. I'm, last little point, my little pedestal, if that's all right. I absolutely love it when I see. Absolutely, I love it when I see like the hardy, reality of nature, like all this grass busting through pavements, everything shooting through the walls, like greenery always literally threatening to spill over. I find it just extremely, I don't know, it makes my tummy funny, you know?
Well, a lot of what you're saying ties back to that notion of a kaleidoscope in mannerism. Like if you were looking at um, if you're looking at a kaleidoscope and you were trying to figure out the origin of what created that specific kaleidoscopic art piece, it would be near
Yeah.
impossible, even if it was
It's,
couched in other similar art pieces and artworks, even if it was couched within the exact art piece that you're taking it from, but you're like, which
I
specific
get
part
you.
of the art piece made up this kaleidoscope? It would be so hard.
It's the Damoclesian sword of the circle, right? It's the poisonous question. It is, oh, where's the start of the circle, huh?
Yeah, you can't.
It's like the eternal threat of the most non-threatening shape. It's got no points.
You know that there's got to be an origin point, but finding that origin point is is like finding a needle in a haystack. Um,
Well, what's interesting though about that is that's only conceptually true. As in, we're thinking about pure circles here, like true circles or whatever. The idea of a circle in our head is really no circle we've ever come into contact with. Does that make sense? Like, we can get close to it, but it's always a material externalization of. I don't want to talk about pre-platonic forms here because that's not kind of what I'm getting at here. But it's more so if we're thinking about this like linguistically, at least. If you don't want to think of it as like the pre-formed idea of a perfect circle, we always come into contact with um,
circular
like
objects
materiality.
know
Yeah. It's like if
existence
you
of circles.
draw a circle on a piece of paper, and then you can probably figure out maybe where the pencil like hit the page at first. And but that obviously doesn't get at um, the sort of the interesting and unique threat of the circle when it's thought about in like a purely conceptual term, which is a meaningful way of like having ethical discussion, I think. But Sorry, I
It's
digress.
mandatory me without you mentioned that like their whole because if you going back to the notion of time, because like the whole notion of a circle is it presupposes it'll end where it began, but only by leaving can it ever come back around to end again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I quite
Like
like
me some
that.
circles.
It's amazing.
And you
Because
don't
in
know
that
where
very
it
same sense as
begins or
well.
ends.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's you could think of that as pure extension, if you want to use the Deleuzian term as well, where it's not bound by it's not cut across like perpendicularly. It's like pure extension without form or thought. It's um uh the idea of, I don't know, I don't want to call it an uninterrupted flow, but like um how do I make this sound normal? So fucking big word pill. It's crazy. It's done numbers on my uh, social conversating. So hard to have ADHD and string this shit together. I don't know, pure extension. Think about that.
No, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
There might be something here with this note, with that goddamn hard ass German word at the end, Nachtraglichkeit. Where's color without pigment when we need them? A history.
I just
But that notion, a history deferred and redoubled in relation to itself. I feel like that also does tie into this notion of like mannerism as a kaleidoscope, too, where it's like, let's put aside the origin point for a little bit. Let's redouble these specific parts in weird ways, folding it over onto itself and create this much more multifaceted, interconnected, and extending um, uh, figure of becoming, or something like that.
um what's interesting, there's a contrast here to actually, maybe it's a contrast, maybe I'm dumb as bricks. But at the very beginning of this chapter, where it talks about the wide acknowledgement of mannerism today, which obviously then goes on to like kind of discredit a little bit, where it talks about mannerism as being a 20th century construction, as in a sort of decadence maybe of academia to go back and taxonomize things, or to ream through history and to give credence where credence is due, but in a very similar way of just installing knowledge production, right? And it talks about this as an inexhaustible mirror image capable of giving our own time its historical validity and prestige. So I find that interesting that the mirror is sort of evoked there, whereas but then again, I think this goes maybe back to something I mentioned a little bit ago, which was when you consider the kaleidoscope of um, interpretations of mannerism. These are usually mostly art historical perspectives. So in that sense, all that somebody seeking to sort of keep capital of like the knowledge production of their time, i.e., the Baroque artists, with their sort of chokehold on what constitutes fine art and what threatens fine art, then uh, damn, sorry, I lost my point completely.
The conflict between high art and mass art.
Yeah, something to that degree.
Yes, and
Or the tension between it.
now it's making me think of the kaleidoscope as just a yes and thing, where you're like, you show someone this beautiful piece of art that you spent so much time focusing on the balance and harmony of it all. And then someone
Yeah.
just is like, oh, yes, and let me just take it real quick. I just want to add a couple things, and they turn the whole thing into a kaleidoscope and give it back to
What
you.
what's fucked about that is you get the same moral revulsion every single time it happens. The same thing happens with phonics, which if you guys aren't familiar with the term, I don't blame you. It is literally when you don't sample parts of a song and include them in your original work, but you take an entire song and then fucking bass boost it, slow it, reverb it. It's the whole vaporwave genre is a is under that like umbrella of plunderphonics, where instead of like sampling bits, you sample the whole fucking thing. It's essentially like almost as if you're stealing the song, but then you're putting something new to it, right? But it's also complete. That people hate vaporwave, or at least they hated vaporwave when it was like starting to creep into the cultural consciousness. I know a lot of people were like responded with like anger almost when they figured out that Macintosh Plus, who was one of the I guess prominent maybe artists in the States, he did like Floral Shop. They did Floral Shop, and I bet all of you have heard like one particular song from there. But when people were like, "Wait, this artist is just copying a bunch of Diane Ross songs and slowing them down. What the fuck is this shit? I can put one effect on a song. Anyone can do this. This is lazy. This is intellectual property theft. This is not real music."
I can paint that. I can paint a painting better than that.
Walking into a Jackson
You know
Pollock
how
art
people go
museum
into
and
that though, and they
shaking
see a
their
really
head.
shit piece of art, and they say, a child could have painted that. It's basically that.
Absolutely. I think what's interesting about that as well is anytime anyone uses a tool when it comes to art, they're always also heralded as like heretics or something, right? As in, like, you know, the people who see things that artists painstakingly draw in Photoshop takes them many, you know, days, right, or weeks of work to get something correct, and people are like, yeah, but it's made with a computer. How hard could it have been? Yeah, I'm honest. Like, you know exactly the you know exactly where I'm going with this in regards to that's just such like retroactive boomer mentality, right? It's like the people saw Michelangelo on a hot, sweaty day out in Venice or wherever the fuck he was painting the Sistine Chapel, and you know you see him carving out this marble, making this perfectly formed golden ratio hunk of a man, very nary a fig leaf to cover his
Straight up
testes,
joking it.
straight up joking it. And by it, well, haha, let's just say my hammer and chisel. Hammer on my
Let's say his
chisel.
paintbrush.
Yeah.
Let's say my painting brushes.
Do y'all want to, should we do one more?
Yeah.
See how far we get, yeah? Do you mind if I read?
Yeah, go.
Yeah, go on.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I feel like yapping. PDF flows, let me open it. Are we on the concept of mannerism?
I think the next one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the late and the new.
Yep.
Okie
The late and the new.
All right. Did you pause it or did you keep rolling? Right.
I'm still recording. I'll probably cut out
Okay.
that middle discussion and start.
All good.
Yeah. So
All right.
This is a little bit of a longer section, so if you want someone else to pick up, just, oh no, it gets to the paradox of style. So
Yeah, it's a
this is
little
just
larger than last.
this is just 2 pages, really. Yeah.
Okay. I can probably make it all the way through.
The late
Okay, let's start.
Awesome.
The late and the new. The properly philosophical distinction between history and becoming deserves special attention, since Mannerism, due to its intrinsic relation to a previous, more classical style, cannot be conceived without its own conception of time. period is often described as a natural extension of the art of Andrea del Sarto, Michelangelo, and Raphael. But we have to distinguish between the simple temporalities that condition an event and the kind of linear causal relationship that art history, as a science, is habituated to prioritize. Adorno's concept of late style, spat still, is particularly relevant here, since, as a sequential rather than a biographical or even chronological concept, it applies to historical epochs no less than to the development of individual artists, such as Beethoven. On the one hand, lateness is a cliché from Romantic art history that locates artistic genius in a creative apotheosis or apophoesis. Apotheosis? Yeah. In the serenity of old age. It has informed the interest in the late Shakespeare, notably The Tempest, which Prospero gives up his magical art toward the end of his career. The late Rembrandt, the late Turner, the late Goethe, but also Keats, Goya, and Picasso. In all these cases, lateness serves as a re-evaluation of times of decadence, with respect to the classical assumption that creativity peaks with maturity and declines thereafter. It culminates in Titian's statement of the age, at the age of 90, when his work acquired a new, all-penetrating and dissolving light, and finally beginning to learn how to paint. On the one hand, what Romanticism signals, on the one hand, what Romanticism regards a moment of final reconciliation between subjective freedom and objective form. On the other hand, Adorno sees through modernist eyes. Instead of a grand synthesis at the end of a constant development, the late Beethoven turns against the new bourgeois order and already anticipates Schoenberg. His last 5 piano sonatas, the last 6 string quartets, the Missa Solemnis, the Diabelli variations, the Bagatelles for piano. Even the Ninth Symphony do not express reconciliation, but alienation and suffering. While it is tempting to psychologize the radical severance between form and substance, the point is that precisely subjectivity steps back from appearance. As Edward Said emphasizes, there is nothing sanguine about growing old, which is rather like a state of exile from the present that can only be endured and deepened. The old Beethoven was almost deaf. Like the late madrigals of Gesualdo, 3 centuries earlier, his late works constitute a sui generis dissonance. It is a music about music, a formal play with repetition and variation that is no longer made for human ears. If lateness is related to modernism more than to romanticism, that is because it is both new and unreproducible. As T.S. Eliot remarked, Shakespeare was not a classicist, and there is no Shakespearean school. Since Thomas Zeresenheit reveals more about the past than about growth, it is no surprise that the historiography of art was itself born with Vasari in the context of the 16th century. For Hegel, the fundamental character of reflexive thought is that it is socialized in the experiences of afterwards. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of dusk. As we shall see, however, Mannerism and the Mannerists seem to escape history. Their conditions of success must be sought elsewhere. Art not only relies on the past to legitimate the present in the sense of providing its enduring model or image, but also seeks to legitimate the past precisely through the emerging present. By giving the model a second existence in the copy, as a copy of a copy, it makes the past return in the present, now here, as a virtual participant in the construction of the future, nowhere. It thus turns repetition against itself, making it a transformative force that grounds a tradition of the moment. As Bergson says, backwards over the course of time, the constant remodeling of the past by the present, of the cause by the effect, is being carried out. For the art historian, this means that Mannerism's way in the future also provides way back into the past, thus giving a whole new meaning to the notion of the early modern. Indeed, as George Diddy Huberman, great name, has shown in his study of Abby Warburg, the very notion of the Renaissance implied a layered and non-linear temporality in which what survives Macleben is a germinal plastic life of forms that does not cease to be reborn and metamorphosized with each of its adaptations and variations, and that anachronizes the historical object by making it coexist with various and heterogeneous times. Perhaps this untimeliness, a strange ambivalence of the late and the new, has led to the paradox that Mannerism never received its own place or actuality within this history. As an essentially contested concept, it has nonetheless persistently been among the constituent questions of art history. And if art history has gradually come to rid itself of its speculative origins, then perhaps philosophy could offer an alternative, indeed more affirmative interpretation than that of an art of epigenes, or epigenes. What if Mannerism? Sorry, my brain is going haywire. Does anyone know if how you pronounce epigenes?
I'm a little behind. I'm catching up to where.
No worries.
I think it'll be Epigonus.
Epigonus.
I'm with Joby.
Just a thought.
I've had to learn words through reading, so I usually mispronounce tons of words. Epigone, a less distinguished follower or imitator of someone. Especially for an artist or philosopher.
Sorry about that. I just had to reset my Bluetooth headphones. Could you repeat that one more time?
Epigone refers to a less distinguished follower or imitator of someone, especially an artist or philosopher, and it comes from the mid-18th century French epigones or Latin epigone, which comes from the Greek epigonoi, which means those born afterwards.
I love the false friend in Epigones, which is I just thought when I first read it, I was like epigons, as in like an epic that has passed. And so I love the idea that the root of it is actually the opposite, or the anterior of it, which is those yet to be born. As at this point, when that word is conceptualized as epics gone past.
I was thinking about epigraph and epitaph.
Oh, very nice. We're just going to go through all the EpiPen, because you only shoot it off, you're having an anaphylactic shock, huh? Thank you very much for that. Sorry.
Epitome.
Such as this conversation being the epitome of our humor.
Yay!
Thank you so much for looking up the definition of that. It was going to play haywire on my brain if I kept reading. I don't mind picking up. I'm going to reread that previous sentence if that's all right. And if art history has gradually come to rid itself of its speculative origins, then perhaps philosophy could offer an alternative, indeed more affirmative interpretation than that of an art of epigenes. What if Mannerism is an abstract tendency that cannot be reduced to its historical conditions of appearance that recurs throughout history, all the while subsisting and insisting virtually, like a problem that outlives its solutions? Instead of abstracting from art history, perhaps we can extract from it a systematic concept that could contribute to art history's concreteness. What is at stake is mannerism not as an object of inquiry, but as a field of operation and creative thought, a slice of chaos which must be turned into a consistent event. The question is not what mannerism is, but what mannerists do, or how they work. How does mannerism break with historical causality, and what is the consistency of its compossibilities? Like all tendencies or events, mannerism should definitely be taken not as a noun, and mannerist not as an adjective, rather as an adverb describing abstract movement without fixed limits. As Werner Hoffmann writes, mannerism does not exist as eternal constraint. My bad. Let me read that one. Werner, you deserve that. Mannerism does not exist as eternal constant, but under different temporary conditions, manneristic modes of behavior are possible, which potentialize themselves into the subsequent processing of particular models and materials. Sometimes mannerist tendencies are fulfilled, taken to their limit, in concrete works of art. More often, they are but a deposit for augmentation, diversion, or transmutation in another kind of art. Artistic styles, Halster reminds us, cannot repeat themselves in the form in which they have become actual once. This means that, when they do, it will be a repetition based on difference instead of the resemblance of models. And in this book, every reference to historically dated objects therefore serves to express a certain transhistorical tendency, emphatically and exemplary, that is, according to a particular intensity, albeit never exclusively, without wanting to compete with art historians. Yet, by relating to the historical reception of works of art as much as possible, I'll propose a purely philosophical answer to the question raised by Deleuze in the informal setting of his final class: what is the mannerist vision and conception of the world? Well, I wasn't able to take notes because I was reading. So,
There was a couple.
Did anything strike you as you were going through?
yeah, fucking pigeons.
Epigonus.
Epigonus. Sucking my epigonus. I wanted to understand. This is probably not a very relevant thought. I think this was a bit of an offshoot, but the bit where Titian, at the age of 90, he says, "I'm finally beginning to learn how to paint." Rather beautiful, right? But
This is horrible, but I'll just it's pronounced Titian.
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 What's horrible about that? Someone's name.
Well, just to it's one of those difficult words that isn't like it's written.
It's okay. You were scared I would say "suck my epigonias" again. I get it.
Suck my Titians.
Oh.
The artist's name is Titian, pronounced Titian.
Thank you.
Very fine artist. If you are lucky enough to, can probably see some in the Rijksmuseum while you're here.
Nice. The idea of a new, all-penetrating and dissolving light, I thought was an interesting phrase, because this is, I'm literally tying this back to prior conversations that won't have much, I think, relevance within any context of the book, take, but the idea of sort of the idea of a mass media in general is one in which it is very all-encompassing, or rather than all-penetrating. It's more like invaginating, if that makes any sense. By which I mean,
if you think about his choice of words, it's more rhizomathic, like something breaking through, rather than the rather than something that's all encompassing. If you think about the rhizomatic thought, it's
I'm with you on that. I'm wondering. There was a reference to mannerism to be considered. I believe this was Mantian speaking, not as a historical object or a sort of epoch even, but more as a um, like a constant becoming, right, or like a constant rupture. But I guess we're kind of getting into like a bit of a Freudian discussion here. Is rupture penetrative? Like, is I don't, because I think in this sense, it's easy to think of like something emerging from concrete as like busting through the earth. But in another, the I think rupture is the stuff within threatening to break through, rather than, or sorry, not within threatening to break through, but like, oh, how do I put this? Uh, I don't know if it's a thing emerging as such. When I think of rupture, at least, I don't think of like things like a single thing emerging. If that makes any kind of sense. I don't know. We're just talking about dick and balls at this point, aren't we? It's so difficult to talk.
This line here that might shed some light. Perhaps this untimeliness, a strange ambivalence of the late and the new, has led to the paradox that mannerism never received its own place of actuality within this history. Maybe that touches on the rupturing or the breaking through that's being discussed here a bit. But I feel like it also maybe relates um, to sort of the circular thinking a bit, and
It circles back to that.
it always circles back to that. But the circular thinking specifically in relation to like our conceptions of time, where we're talking about, I think a little bit before they were talking about, uh, indeed, as George Diddy Huberman has shown in his study of A.B. Warburg, the very notion of the Renaissance implied a layered and non-linear temporality, in which what survives is a germinal plastic life of form that does not cease to be reborn and metamorphosized with each of its adaptations and variations. So maybe something that Mannerism took from the Renaissance period before, was that layering of, or that effect of layered and non-linear temporality. But with circular thinking, time becomes, not just layered, but cyclical, but not quite cyclical, but where past, present, and future all exist in a more fluid relationship rather than like a strict sequence of like a triangle which has 3 points, and maybe like a thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or something like that.
I think something you touched on there that's really interesting is the squeezing of mannerism out of history itself. But it actually doesn't. Despite so I wasn't actually aware of mannerism at all before we started reading this book. I was a fool. I was misguided. But more generally, I was thinking of art history as kind of roughly being sequential, which was like MB bad thinking, in the sense where if I thought about what was happening around the um, shift from Art Nouveau to Art Deco to all sorts of like, I'm thinking of them in just like linearities, right?
It's separate movements.
I know they're separate movements. They, arise adjacently. I can use all the language. I can
That's right.
similarly, there's a notion in Toulouse and Guattari actually that I think is interesting here. When this historically speaking, if we were to take the view that mannerism never existed at all and was so desperate in its singularities that because it cannot be captured it should not exist, which is the view that some art historians have taken, then why are we able to discuss it? What is there from it that we glean? Why is the question unsettled? And if you want to, before I talk about Bergson also mentioned something here about the idea of not posing the right questions, that the answers are already out there long before we even dream of them. The real way of getting to an answer is posing the correct question, right? So it's a problem of methodology and ideology more so than it is of a substantial disconnect between us and anything else. But with Deleuze and Guattari specifically on the point that you made, Brett, of the mannerism kind of like rupturing, bursting through, making itself real. I think even in the book, I was going to touch on this. It creates an immanent field. Uh, um, it doesn't cease to occupy that zone. And uh, sorry, 1 second. I'm getting my ducks in a row mentally. Yeah, with losing Guattari, there's the concept of no, not heterogenealogy, just of genealogy in general, which is essentially the art historical view, right? To look backwards into the past, to state what has happened, and leave it at that, right? But in that there's also the concept of in from D&G of vampirism or of a almost viralistic force or like an undercurrent. And the idea of vampirism and why that is relevant is because there is no genealogy as such to discuss of when talking about a vampiric force. As in, if you think about how they reproduce not by having children, so they are removed from the symbolic order of Oedipality, but through infection, similar to other sort of archetypal forms like lycanthropy, right? There is no mode of history to which you can cleanly refer back to. It's not like a procession of forms, but more like something inhabiting something else. And if you think about mannerism in this case, where it is a corruptive force, or at least the ways in which the Baroque artists referred to it as a corruptive force was like, nah, it's corroding my traditional stable bases of marble and salt. It's more a corruptive force in the sense of it focuses on decay, the corruptive force of life itself, right? Life is not separate from death, but life contains within it death, right? It's, the unsettling nature of nature. Um, and
That really hits on something that I say, like every civilization lives in the ruins of the previous empire.
absolutely, I think about that all the
Like
time.
what you were saying there, where everything is inhabiting something else. Like
Yeah,
we are inhabiting the ruins of the previous empire, and we are like the previous. Like we're doing today's work with yesterday's tools and yesterday's language,
yeah.
and there has to be a there
Yeah.
has to be a reordering of those things.
I think I largely follow where you're coming from, and I find it very interesting. I for some reason there's like wriggling like thought in me that there is intention somewhere, but I can't phrase it, so I cannot say it. But I'll
On
definitely
the
look
notion
deeper about
of
that.
the corruptive force of decay and stuff, and what's sort of been mentioned already, we can maybe tie this to the idea of lateness in mannerism as well. And specifically, if we're thinking about lateness as old age, that's what I was sort of,
Uh-huh.
and mannerist artwork sort of has, it has this feeling of maturity or like a complete exhaustion of the Renaissance ideals that came before. But
Mm.
it also implies like this transitional period too, and that relation of life and death that uh, Joby was talking about, but this lateness in old age and during this transitional period, where it's a period between established norms that you've gotten used to over the decades and emerging new perspectives that basically make you feel out of touch with the world now, and that sort of temporal tension, and anxiety and complexity and contradiction,
Yeah.
in lateness and in mannerism that we can see. Um, that sense of urgency in mannerism, um, feeling out of pace with uh, with the expectation of time and events and stuff like that. Um, that
Do you repeat? So I don't want to cut off your trail of thought. That was very rude of me. I was wondering if you could just repeat uh, the last 30 seconds. It was very interesting.
um, sort of like well, I'm sort of thinking of this. Shout out boomers. Sort of thinking of this in terms of old age and a lot of the thoughts that come about
Old
from
age. Thank you.
old age. Yeah. So lateness, and because they mention the word lateness in this to describe mannerism, um, and we're talking about it in terms of the corruptive forces of decay, but then it's not really a corruption per se. It's like um, a necessary part of life.
Mhm.
But and the thing that I was saying maybe 30 seconds ago was like that sense of anxiety and complexity that comes about when you're in the golden years, and um, reality isn't really what you are used to. There's all these new ideas. You're out of touch, but then
Yeah.
it's not all negative though, and it definitely doesn't have to be negative. Um, but there is sort of a lateness of feeling out of time.
Yeah.
Um, and this also sort of connects to that nonlinear aspect of mannerism, where this sense of chronological order really just gives way to an emotional um, ordering of events where symbolism becomes extremely important. Um, and you
It's
start getting these sense of like undefined timelessness, and you sort of dislocate from a clear historical context. You're not really in the present, though you are. And there is sort of this timelessness or timeliness that disorients you and yet intrigues you in a way. And I feel like that stuff also relates to mannerism in a lot of ways.
I genuinely do agree with that. I like the idea of feeling out of time because that implies quite a lot of things that appear close to me at least. Um, by which I mean the instability that people must have felt at many different periods of time. It's like very easy, I think, to consider, say, the uh, perhaps atomized times of our life today as a rate of unparalleled change, but I don't think this is so. Um, I want to quickly talk about some threads I had in my head in response, whilst I have them fresh in my mind, because I know they're just going to whisper away to fucking dust. When you mentioned old age, it very much reminded me of Jay's original infographic, the one on the three modes of time, of talking about you know, the in one sense of the word, in the biblical sense, there's the Garden of Eden, there's the fall, there's the redemption arc, but also in the um, more ancient sense, I suppose, of thinking about it in terms of venerability. You know, four legs in the morning, two in the afternoon, three in the evening. What's I think interesting if you want to apply the was it an Egyptian concept, that idea of time? It was the Sphinx's riddle, right?
Well, that's the from the myth of Oedipus. So it's like the Greek time. But I mean, the thinkers in the classical times, they thought of like a flower budding, then blooming, then decay. So they had a three-phase concept of time as well. And that's something that you see in those, yeah.
So what's interesting about the Greek conceptualization of
Oh
time in that
well,
sense? Do you want to go ahead?
simply that they were using. The thing I find fascinating is like what happened. You had the Hellenization of the people in around the like the rise of the Greek sort of city states, and then you had the Roman Empire, and the people were quite Hellenized or Greekicized, basically. So those ideas were flowing down.
I was actually thinking about
the
Greek
really
mythology.
the really interesting thing is that the Jewish people, the way I see it, had a reversal of time in the diagram where they think about and the way that Vasari uses it as well, that you're in an ideal situation, then you have a fall, then you're restored to pretty much the same situation you were before the fall.
Yeah.
And but it's just fascinating that they were like these are mythological modes of time because the only like as you guys are saying right now, the only we live like we live in a moment where the past is gone, the future never quite arrives, and we live in this sort of permanent present.
Yeah.
And it's quite existential, and but it's just fascinating that they subverted the idea of time and kind of reversed it. Like by you.
In a way, and I hope this isn't like too gauche. I wonder if it's because I think it is sensible to think of it as a reversal. But in my mind, I am perhaps imagining the sort of abstract machine that governs the ethics of any people or group. Um, and I'm wondering how much the uh, again, this might be a bit gauche, so I apologize. I'm wondering how much the psychological functions of a abstract machine that governs like the ethics of any given people has to do with like
Well,
the way in which they ethically come to consider directions.
If you think about the way that the Greeks, like theoretically, the Jewish people didn't write. If you think about this from a literary perspective, the Jewish people, that whole model, the model of the U shape that I've shown, is the model of comedy. Like there's a fall, and then ha ha ha, there's a restoration at the end, right? But the Greek mode of literature is the tragedy. So it's like wow, look at how like we conquer and then oh no, tragedy, something happens, we die, you know, like that. So those are the two modes of literary thought, shall we say, that are underneath each of those societies in the ancient Near East at that time. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Whilst I can't like respond directly to that, it does sort of remind me of hold on, sorry, my notes keep getting flung around the room. Um, there was I think Brett mentioned the point on venerability earlier, which was how old age had come to be almost revered in Renaissance times, or at least there was some aspect which was prized by virtue of venerability. And it's an interesting, perhaps, reversal of something which happened earlier, which is I'm again going to talk about the horizon of religiosity that like much governed a lot of human history, and consider what the perhaps the first decline of that and the replacement of bespoke theories of the world, such as all the forms of thought that come to flourish under an evolving humanistic sense of the world. Modernity, liberty, all these lovely things, the great man principle, all this shit we love to talk about. But on the great man principle, actually, the fact that this idea that history is built by the victors, or at the very least, it's carved in human hands, that we are steering a ship, so to speak. You just have to think about the Leviathan, right? The idea of a patron of the world, right? That we are given sort of by some kind of virtue the role of a shepherd for the whole planet. But this is by human hands, and that's a big sort of concept of the. This is where we get the new ideas about like we don't want god emperors anymore. We want emperor kings, and or divine rulers, right? And we need to dispense with like the frivolity of some divine narrative that gives us the right to govern. We have earned this right by being here where we stand now. It's all very humanist thinking, right? But I digress a little bit. The idea of um, in prior times, in a where sickness and death are perhaps more close to home, um, where the worldview is well, where the immediate environment is perhaps more communal, where there is less of an insistence on like a nuclear family unit or an atomized individual, as was become apparent in the in the Industrial Revolution, who is like flung far afield to go fend for themselves, in the great waves of urbanization. The pre-modern subject is gonna be much more cared after by a community, maybe a parish perhaps, right? Um, what I mean by this all is when people have a faith, I'm thinking of maybe a Middle Ages Christian faith, for example, there is also a belief in eternity to a degree, or at the very least, a belief in something after, something we cannot achieve here, something which is a transcendental afterness. And this is, achieved through a irreversible passage through death to another place. So, in this way of considering the world, what does it matter if you die at 2 years old, 20 years old, if you live the long right life of a 60-year old? What does it matter if afterwards always comes eternity? And the reason I think that's important to consider is it would then make sense for that idea of of you know um, there is a there is an Eden, it is elsewhere. Um, we are on Earth for a brief beautiful moment, and then we fall into death. I think the fact that the second conceptualization of time, where it's a fall and then a rise, would sorry, I'm thinking so slowly at the moment. I think there's a strong reason why, when a decline in faith and a decline in an eternity afterwards is guaranteed, it makes sense that people would come to view their own mortality as a race against the clock, or at least it is more important to achieve what you want now in life.
But going back to the mannerist thing a
Yep.
little bit, Joby brought up this concept of urgency, and I felt like that sort of in lateness, in old age, in mannerism, and I felt like that sort of touched back on this sense of dislocation from time that comes from old age, that really gets characterized by um, a sense of delay, both delay and anticipation. Um, that sort of touches on the complexities of like human experience and that interconnected dance between the inevitability of death and the personal narrative of your own life. Um, and there was maybe a couple more things that stood out to me in this chapter when discussing mannerism. I keep going back to the description of it being like kaleidoscopic, um, in terms of mannerisms, like very intricate composition, and you have this very varied repetition, whether it's vertumnus and all the different variations and repeated themes of vegetables that make up the vegetable man. And this like shifting and overlap in unexpected ways, this distortion, um, which is much like looking through a kaleidoscope. If I'm thinking back to vertumnus, or and to move away from vertumnus, that image of the cat that's made up of a bunch of stuff really sticks out in my brain as something kaleidoscopic, um, in the sense of like continuously shifting and like dynamic, like this multifaceted, dynamic and base and almost disorienting effect, that invites you to see multiple perspectives simultaneously, in that repetition and variation. Um, and maybe going back to kaleidoscope again, um, where you have uh, these previous ideas from the High Renaissance that are being taken, but are also being altered and extended, um, and modified in very unusual ways to sort of create a dialogue between past and present, which I think also connects to in an interesting way. Did we lose permanent marker? Damn it.
That's okay.
I wanted to get more of their thoughts too. But it also connects to circular thinking in a very interesting way. And I was now thinking of circular thinking as like a portal between past and present, um, where um, it sort of touches on that like anachronistic element in mannerism, that collapsing between these temporal boundaries and this like blending of the two historical periods. Um, I guess you could sort of see lateness and old age as like a type of like approaching portal circular thinking. I don't know.
No, it's okay. I do follow where you're coming from, in the sense that the conceptualizations of time, as at least in the representation that Jay drew, were lines that start in the middle of nowhere, dip, and end in the middle of nowhere. Whereas you could also read them as incomplete semicircles, which end at like the boundary of death, or at least that is the moral and personal application of time, right? We get shot out into the universe before we're even conscious, and then we die, and we don't know how that feels because we don't know what it's like to dispossess consciousness. It's something that will be unfamiliar to all of us until it happens. Um, and that is why it's seen as like a penultimate barrier. It's why it's seen as like our access to a material world is in some ways purely spiritual, but at the same time we are vehicles, and this is what separates. I mean, if you want to think of it in Gnostic terms, right? This is um, oh man, I bring up Gnosticism and I can't even remember any of the names. This is like Sophia's world, right? The world of materiality, which by virtue of being material is separate from a another way, another world. That one being one of, you know, um, function, I guess, without form. If you maybe you want to put it that way, but it's maybe not the best way of putting it. But you could see perhaps if you were to consider them as um, semicircles in its representation that are cut in half through like this impermeable barrier, which is in the moral and personal sense death, you could then imagine it as a circle, right? At least in a Gnostic sense, where it is a transitionary period or a passing through, um, and it comes with all the thorny implications that circularity provides. I don't know what the Gnostic interpretation of life after death is, TBH, but I find it interesting to consider that one in terms of like a bifurcated or split world. Um, but I digress a little bit because I know the point in Christianity is largely that um, um, afterwards is an eternity, rather than like a circular or a Gnostic interpretation of nature and life and death. Um, I do also. I am also caught up by the concept of lateness as you are, Brett, as well, because I feel like the way in which you interpreted displacement of people, I think is largely important. But also you touched on some like accelerationist things too, which I can talk about in a second. The displacement of people is, or the rupturing of old things, or the transitionary period. Obviously, is ties like hugely to Jay's conception of Gothic architecture, um, and the like rupture and trying to concretize, I suppose, the very anxious nature of the time. But it's also the nature of time in that it reverberates, and that these anxieties are not done away with even after the
I
era has moved
yeah,
on.
I think there's a parallel with our time here. I was going to say the weird thing about those two, the wave shapes, is that they are like the way that a beam of light from the sun to the earth is described as like this wavy line like that that keeps repeating.
A sine wave,
So
yeah.
both of those modes of time, like basically the wavy line, if you like join them together ad infinitum, they are like a light wave.
Um, Going back real quick, one last very weird thought relating to circular thinking, portals, life and death and stuff. Um,
More than welcome.
huh? And
Just said more than welcome. Continue.
oh yeah. And I'll also get it maybe a little sexual, but I think this interconnective point between the past and present could be this portal and circular thinking could be considered as birth, which would be opening up a pathway to the future, which would be death, where every end is a beginning and every beginning is an end. and where the in betweenness of life reflects the endless possibilities of creation. So, birth is a portal and death is a portal. Um, and how this sort of relates to mannerism is birth being that gateway to continuous transformation and redefinition. Um, and that, like, not just birth in the material sense, like a physical corporeal body, but also birth in terms of new styles, techniques, and reinterpretations of what came before in that new body. Um, Basically, births of new ways of seeing, understanding, and moving about the world. Um, Sort of like a sort which would be sort of kaleidoscopic and circular in a sense. Um, but death too also being a gateway, not like an end, but that which allows for future stuff to come about. Um,
Very similar in a way to how people would have considered eternity in a time where it's always promised after death. At the very least, that's what you tell grieving mothers, right? If you're a good Catholic. Um, the idea of transitioning from one state of affairs to another state of affairs is a very common idea in most religions and mythologies that pay any credence to a kind of passage of time. And nearly all of them find time to be something that is so it requires so much like mythologizing that each different faith or way of being has a stringent mythology on how time should be considered, and that's exactly why you get the graphing of biblical time over the Bible. You get the conceptions of life after birth in certain forms of like Shinto animism. You run the whole gauntlet of like concepts and passions for life, and you'll find like someone who also felt the same thing somewhere. Um, but the the more on the point, the idea of what you were saying about birth being this kind of shitting out into consciousness, and then death also being the same shitting out of consciousness. Um, the idea of like a transitionary period here is really dominated by what ideology you kind of are surrounded with at any given time.
to
By
relate it to
which
like
I'll
the religious thing, right? You have the death of a previous ideal, which would be your current life, your family, your loved ones, stuff like that, and you transition, or the death of a previous ideal for the emergence of another ideal, which would be heaven. And in that moment, you have this like recycling and reimagining. I think a lot of people imagine their loved ones that they have on earth, but just in heaven with a mansion or something like that. Um,
yeah,
you know, um,
yeah, I think it almost doesn't matter the individual yearning. It's more so the belief in the afterlife is sometimes strong enough to keep. I mean, it's just a wild faith. It's a wild leap into the unknown, and it is essentially only as powerful as people believe in it to be.
we're talking about sort of the philosophy of like life, death, that transition of an ideal of living to the transition of heaven. To move this away from philosophy and sort of back to art history, we can also look at death in mannerism as more than an end in the sense of the death of the traditional Renaissance ideals, allowing for the birth of mannerism later, and the death of
Mm.
mannerism allowing for the birth of the Baroque and etc. and blah blah blah.
I don't I don't agree with that, but only in the sense that I think it maybe doesn't make too much sense to consider Mannerist as an Oedipal transitionary. So what I mean by that is there's a very personal and moral relationship that we all have to death, which is that we know perhaps that we don't transcend it. Like that's always the open possibility that it is the closure of all that is known. However, that possibility is only one that is breached by faith. Faith that you will not die when you die. Um, and I think that
Yeah, that your life would extend
in
into the afterlife in a very mannerist way.
yeah, well, the way in which I almost didn't agree with what you were saying, although I understand completely where you're coming from, is that I do think mannerism emerges more as a vampiric force, one that it's like an undertow that threatens to drag you down at any point, right? Which is why it's sandwiched kind of out of existence as like a non thing. It was never here, and yet it like sort of bubbles to the surface. There is something which still yearns to be known, and I think it kind of mostly makes sense as a necrotic force in the same way in which they were painting necrotic forces. But by which I mean it's
Definitely.
not a perversion in so much as a perversion implies a twisting of a um, acceptable uh, social sexual like behavior. Rather, it is a corruptive force nonetheless. I don't need to point much further, I think, than the putrescence of some of the images.
The
The
fishy. That makes it. I don't know if you
what was that, sorry?
there's the one that came to mind when you were talking about the necrotic force was the sea creature painting that creates a human. I feel like in that necrotic force, there is sort of like a transformative recycling that's going on that could be a shared theme
Yeah.
between both of this stuff we're talking about.
hmm I think within that slice of chaos, which is an unending rupture, yeah, at the same time, not a rupture without form. Um, I also think there is not a desire in Mannerist artists to be like harbingers of doom per se, but more also living through the same time as the people around them who were acting as if knowledge production is safe and sound. Everyone should just believe in common sense. The traditional order is fine. Do not panic. Like, I think that these artists sketching out the anxieties of the time is more an effort to be reflective of the very real experiences of being torn asunder. The idea of the ground being shaken, never to like have the tectonic plates fucking jam back to a Pangea. There's no Eden. Essentially, it's only rift and precarity. I'm actually very struck actually by the idea that the printing press, like, because oftentimes we denigrate older technologies as being older and stupid. I would never use a typewriter. I have a computer. But at the same time, this kind of like denigration almost uh, slaughters the actual emotive and very literal human, impact of these technologies at a given time. The printing press must have been such a fucking banger. You know what I mean? Um,
The typewriter is
not,
a big one
but
in
only
Dracula too. You might be interested in looking up some essays on the significance of the typewriter in Dracula.
for sure. I'd love to. The I think point to note actually with the printing press specifically is the idea of acceleration and technological transformation going hand in hand with societal change. Uh, that is something which could be thought about briefly in terms of acceleration. And when I say that, I mean the example I like to use a lot of the time is considering uh, what were the big technological impacts of the Industrial Revolution. And I don't know about you guys, but obviously a lot of things went on, so it's hard to like pick a thing. But for me, I think about trains. I don't know why.
Mm.
I just have this idea of the steam locomotive engine being an indispensable part of the imagery for me in the Industrial Revolution. And I think
Yeah,
there was something
absolutely.
It was for
I think,
people
yeah,
back then too. One of my professors was telling a story about his professor, um, and he was talking to his professor once, who's probably dead now, R.I.P. But he asked him like, "Is there anything that you really remember from growing up, or something like that, right?" Um,
yeah,
and he said like, "Well, I keep having this recurring dream." And the recurring dream was basically him on like a steam engine train going home. Um,
Hmm.
I don't know, but yeah, that's sort of how to sort of get at how impactful the trains were to, and maybe how intense of an innovation it would have been.
thank you for sharing that. It's really touching.
Yeah.
Well, Joby, you have to think about people were not as literate as today, and even with the printing press, it may be that only 20% of people could read. Like
That is true.
modern mass literacy only arrives around from after 1900, and
That
really
is,
only in the
yeah.
1920s. But just yeah, it's a mad thing. Like the books were luxury items um,
Knowledge was still
in
largely divided by
in
class.
that
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
I thank you. That's a really important caveat because I think what's interesting about that, in at least terms of acceleration, is that the more interesting thing is what if there was a 98% world literacy rate at the time of the printing press? What would have changed?
Oh, and can I say
Right?
one more? Can I say
Go
one
for
more
it. Go
thing,
for it.
really,
Of
really,
course.
really quick? Like when I was saying about the painters would go, basically, a painter would go to an engraver and get the engraver to make a copy of their painting, and then a whole lot of copies of that painting would be pressed and sent out, like an early form of
Yeah, yeah,
advertising in a way. And
yeah, 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 yeah.
this starts with Albrecht Dürer over in um, is it Nuremberg where he lived? I
You
hope
tell me,
so.
baby.
Anyway, yeah, I think it's Nuremberg. Anyway, like basically he people kind of realize, and this is kind of like a capitalist thing, like you could be a painter and paint like a beautiful painting and it would cost so much. Like it would roughly, for a wealthy craftsperson, it would cost about 2 months of their wages to get a portrait. Like, so if you were a wealthy carpenter or a
Yeah,
metal worker or whatever you're doing in the medieval times, if you were one of the wealthy, the top, say the top 20% of the, or top half of the society, you would have earned, like, say you were the same as today, like in a relatively the same position as today in that middle class thing.
yeah.
It would cost you 2 months' salary to pay for a portrait painting. This is in the 16th century and
Okay.
a little bit and a little bit earlier, coming out of the late 15th. Well, Dürer realized he could make these prints and press a whole lot of copies, and instead of like making one painting that's like say $60,
Yeah,
you could make
yeah,
like 100 prints and sell them for $5 each or $3 each. So it's like this change to the mass, like, and you can think about this in the
yeah.
terms of Walter Benjamin's or Walter Benjamin's art in the age of mechanical reproduction. But that process really starts back around 1500, 1520, when Dürer is starting to do that.
I love that. He saw a fucking gap in the market. The entrepreneurial spirit doesn't need Freeman to let it loose.
And
It's funny though.
here's the mad thing. When Italian visitors arrive in the Netherlands in the 17th century, they write home and say there's three things they say. The first thing they say is, it appears that everyone here can read, but the literacy rates are only 20%, and in some places in Italy around the top, like Venice, maybe Florence, maybe Rome, in some of the parts where the Renaissance has started in the late 15th, the literacy rates might be from around 14% to 20%. That's
Guys,
what
name
they
again?
think. Those 14 to 20% of the
Okay.
population could read. One
Who
fifth
was
of the population.
Oh, okay.
This is
Who said everyone here can read?
well, it's Italian people like were visiting. There's a big cultural interchange between the Netherlands and Italy, and the Mannerist style travels up to the Netherlands. But there are a lot of Italian visitors, and like some of the things, I can't tell you the names of the people, but in the records, in the letters that they're writing home, they say, it appears that everyone here can read.
Okay.
So they're kind of exaggerating, but let's say generously, maybe a maximum of 20% of people could read, which was quite a lot for the time. They also
Yeah.
say it appears that everyone has paintings in their home, even the poorest people can afford some prints on their walls.
That's
So there
so funny.
was
They didn't
art.
know.
There was art to cater to every taste and every price range. Like you might buy a real painting and hang it in your house, but someone who isn't as wealthy as you might go out and buy like a poster and get it framed and stick it on their wall. It's the same thing today as it was in
I mean,
1582 or whenever it was.
I love that.
And the last thing the Italians say, they said that the Dutch people were the best fed people in Europe. So when you see the Golden Age paintings of all the food on the tables, that's what the people were actually eating at the time, and it was a very prosperous time. So I
I find that
mean,
really
that
interesting.
is that is the top class of the people, but even the poorer people could afford art, could afford prints, and even the poorer people were doing okay with food, and even in that little what's referred to as the Golden Age, which is now a contested term historically, but that's what some of the letters home to Italy are saying about life in the Netherlands
I,
at that time.